Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about business, innovation, and managing life. We seem to have lots of questions here that were saved up from last time or have come in on our submission form. Let me see. The first one here listed is from Paul, who asks, are periodic boom and bust cycles of the economy inevitable, or should we be by now be capable of managing national economies better, simultaneously avoiding both recessions and excessive inflation? It's a very interesting question. I've wondered about the exact same thing. I don't know the answer. I will say a few things. I mean, one of the things that I've learned from my work in basic science is that you might think, if you kind of know the rules by which a system operates, that you can then immediately say, oh, this is everything that will happen in that system. But it's not true. There's a phenomenon I call computational irreducibility that basically says the only way you can know what will happen in the system is to run the system and see what happens. It's kind of analogous to what we know in writing programs. You know, there are always the unexpected bugs. You think you've written a program that just does this, but actually something happens that you didn't expect. That's kind of a side effect of this phenomenon of computational irreducibility. But one of the things about economics is there a way of sort of controlling things to the point where nothing unexpected will ever happen? Certainly, you know, 100 years ago, 150 years ago or so, you know, when people were thinking about, you know, sort of Marxist, socialist, economic systems, there was kind of I think that was at a time when sort of the modernism in everything was coming in, and it's like, we finally got it. You know, we can understand nature, we can understand this, we can understand that. We will be able to control and compute everything. And that was, in a sense, the sort of the early thought in a bunch of these areas is now we're in this sort of, our math, our science has gotten sophisticated enough. We just move these levers and we'll be able to control what happens. I think interestingly, you know, in 1931, when Gödel's theorem sort of broke that idea for mathematics, I don't know exactly when Hayek and people like that were writing about similar kinds of issues in economics. I mean, I think Hayek had sort of an early version of this computational irreducibility idea, not as formally as the kinds of things that are developed, but the same kind of thought. So the question is, in the way that economics works, and it's not obvious what economics is. Actually, just yesterday, we were doing a live stream talking about kind of the use of the formalism that comes from our physics project for economics. And it's still a little bit unclear sort of what economics really is. There's this whole network of transactions that are happening between people that somehow sort of knit together this whole structure that we call the economy, and that sort of keep the kind of keep the sort of social structure of the world held together. But that's kind of what that means in terms of I mean, it's sort of what economics might be, but kind of what is the fundamental theory of it. I mean, there's so many mysteries. For example, here's an example of one. So you look at a stock market, any other kind of market, there are often random variations of prices. People will say, oh, that's because there's always new information coming into the market. But we can plainly come up with examples where there really is no new information coming in. So then people will say, well, if it wasn't random like that, then you could predict what was going to happen, and then you could make money by predicting it, and that kind of arbitrage loop would force it to not have that same predictability anymore. There's some truth to that. But it isn't really a constructive theory of why there's that randomness in the market. I think the reason there's that randomness in the market is it's a sign of this computational irreducibility phenomenon. Now, does that mean that, so as a kind of, you've got computational irreducibility going on, you're a central banker, let's say, and you're trying to control what happens, are there levers of a kind that you can move as a central banker that will cause the economy to, at the level of its computational irreducibility, will control it closely enough to be able to achieve the result you want? It's not obvious. It's like asking, if you have, I don't know, a bunch of gas molecules bouncing around. There's some, I don't know, nitrogen and there's some oxygen or something. And you say, can I separate the nitrogen from the oxygen? Well, if all you've got is a great big paddle that you're, able to put into the gas, or you're able to put, walls of a piston into the gas, no, you probably can't separate the nitrogen and the oxygen. For that, you would have to go in and sort of use much more computational and other effort to go and sort individual molecules. And it's just not obvious, to me at least, these phenomena like inflation, for example, to what extent that is, what kinds of, whether the levers that one has available in, for example, a traditional economy are sufficient to deal with that. Maybe there are levers that could be applied in economies where there's in a sense more detailed control, or there's potential for more detailed control, like cryptocurrency economies, things like that. Maybe there are different kinds of things one could do. I don't think anybody's figured out how to do that. I mean, that's been even in virtual worlds, for example, there's the same issue of inflation and so on. I gather that there's been fairly successful control of things in those cases. And I don't know why that's been easier to do than for large scale economies. I mean, to me, the thing I've been saying recently is that now is the kind of 100-year test of the science of economics. I mean, people say, oh, there were these terrible things that happened in the 1920s, 1930s, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There were these things that happened in the 1980s, whatever. Now we understand everything better, and we'll be able to move the levers correctly to not have these things happen. We'll see. I think there may be sort of fundamental theoretical reasons why it's hard, and there also may be reasons about the dynamics of society that make it hard, that are maybe separate from the dynamics of, if we think of economics as this sort of network of transactions, then there's also kind of society with all these interactions between people and so on, of a perhaps non-economic nature. And I don't know how those, whether the sort of boom and bust cycles, which after all people have talked about for almost throughout history, this idea of cycles like that is something very commonly talked about historically and so on. And is that a feature, for example, of the intrinsic nature of us humans, that we're forcing that to happen? Is that a feature of the way economics works? It's not clear to me. Is that something where we have figured out enough how to move the levers that it won't happen again? I have to say, while it would be nice if that was true, I rather doubt it. So at least my thoughts. I mean, the whole question about to what extent is there a science of economics and what can one kind of predict and so on is an interesting question. I mean, it could be the case that there are things one can predict, they just don't happen to be things we care about. The things that we care about that have a large scale human effect, whether it's inflation rate or unemployment or whatever else, might be things where those are hard to predict. It might be that there's some detailed thing about the correlation between, the velocity of money here and this and that and the other that is predictable. That's a feature, just like when you have molecules bouncing around in a gas, there are certain things about pressure and volume and so on that are predictable. But if what you really cared about was whether the nitrogen and oxygen separate in the box, well, sorry, that's not something that one can control or predict, so to speak. So, I think it could be that there's a mismatch potentially between the kinds of things that are significant to us as humans coming out of an economy and the kinds of things which there can be a sort of scientific level prediction where we can kind of have a narrative story about what's going on. So, but I don't know what will happen there. I think that there's a lot of potential data from things like virtual worlds and to some extent cryptocurrencies that's more detailed than we've ever had before, and that has the possibility of giving one sort of the raw material to make models that haven't really existed before. I mean, it's worth remembering historically, back in the early 1800s, there was this idea that just like physics had been supposedly solved by Newton with calculus and all that kind of thing, that there would be a social physics that would kind of solve the problems of society in the same kind of way. It didn't work out. I think it would also be an overstatement to say that physics was solved at that time. That also, it was just that the things that people concentrated on were things that were solvable by the methods, mathematical and other, that people have developed. I mean, I think I've often noted that, the fact that Newton back in the 1600s had chosen sort of the mechanics of solid objects of, how does this planet move? How does this ball bounce? Things like that, to be the subject of his mechanics. That was very fortunate for him. If instead he'd chosen fluid mechanics, he would not have been able to conclude that things in mechanics work according to the kinds of simple laws he came up with. So it was really he looked at things about which there were ready predictions that could be made, while there were other things that he could have looked at where that wouldn't be the case. And so that can play out again in these other areas, including, for example, economics. Let's see. Another question here we have from Architect. Boy, this is an interesting one because I'm not completely sure how to interpret it. The question was, what modes does Stephen Wolfram have? So I suppose what that means is, if you watch me through a day, through a week, whatever else, what if, is it like, am I always kind of acting like the same person, or do I have kind of a persona when I'm doing this versus when I'm doing that, and so on? I think I am more uniform than many people. I think that the version of me that you kind of see in these live streams is, and perhaps it's a bad thing to admit, surprisingly similar to the version of me that you see in a lot of other cases. The only difference here is that this is a monologue. I like to think I'm capable of kind of dialogue and conversation as well. But I would say that one mode is kind of this interactive mode. Another mode is I just sit by myself and write things usually. Usually my way of actually producing something has to be, I'm doing a computation, I'm writing something. I'm not very good at just quietly think. I tend to be, it's either when I'm interacting with people or when I'm sort of virtually interacting with the world through typing things and writing Wolfram language code, writing English, whatever else. What I have found is that when I like people, so when I'm in situations where I can interact with people, I choose to do it, and I'll start conversations with all sorts of people. I will say that perhaps, and it's a sort of perhaps a personal admission of something, I'm not very good at the small talk part of those conversations. I tend to like to learn stuff. I'm more interested usually in learning stuff than in sort of imposing what I know, so to speak. But I'll leave that for these live streams, perhaps. But I'm not. I tend to be somebody who is. I like learning stuff from people about all kinds of different kinds of things. I don't really know. Not very good at the pure small talk. It's the same kind of thing. If I am giving some public presentation of something, as soon as there's content, I'm in good shape. But if it's like, can you do some sort of just sort of general honorific introduction-y thing, I'm pretty bad at that. I find it, I kind of have to have content or I don't know what I'm doing, so to speak. I would say that it is one of the things that I've noticed about myself, at least, is like if I'm in some meeting, like for example, right after this, I'm doing some board meeting for some nonprofit I'm involved with. Okay, and I kind of know myself well enough to know that I will either say nothing or I will be kind of dominating the meeting. I find it pretty hard to do I find it pretty hard to sort of fully pay attention when I'm not participating in some way. And as soon as I participate, I tend to perhaps be, I tend to say lots, so to speak. So I suppose those are, what other modes could I describe? I mean, I think that it's interesting that most kinds of situations I'm in, I'm kind of in charge of my own destiny, so to speak. And it's rather rare that I'm in situations where it's like I'm doing some activity and somebody is just saying, do this, do that, do the other thing. It's a little bit relaxing when I am in that position, although it's kind of rare, because most of the time it's like, well, I've got to figure out what to do next. And it's sort of nice sometimes to not be doing that. Anyway, I'm not sure that's a very good description, but just a little bit on that. Let's see. Okay, the Parker asks, what are my personality traits? This is a comment from somebody on my team about my modes. Okay, this is her comment. High intensity problem solving, figuring out, and joyous versus figuring out and annoyed. Okay, well, I can try and take that apart. I mean, it is true that okay, that's actually a more useful point to make, perhaps. You know, in running our company, for example, one of the things that I have noticed about myself is that if I'm in some meeting and people are describing something that's been done, there is a passive mode that I have where it's just like, let me listen to what's been done and sort of edit it, comment on it. And then there's a different mode where it's like, let me really wrap my brain around this and be capable of leading it and sort of say what I think should happen and try and figure out what should happen and so on. And one of the things that I find a limitation on my part is that when I'm in kind of editing mode, where I'm just sort of making point comments about this is, I noticed that's wrong, et cetera, that sometimes I don't dig deep enough. And, the sort of full investment of wrap my arms around the thing is something that, well, I can do that, but it will take a lot longer. And one of the things that can go badly and which has to be managed is if there are sort of repeated reviews of some project, for example, and there are enough of these reviews that I just couldn't take the time every time to wrap my arms fully around the thing and really understand what's going on. And so I end up going in this sort of pure editing mode. And when I say editing, I mean like an editor of an English piece of text, of just marking a few comments here and there, rather than I'm really going to dig in and see how to write this thing. I think that's a tricky thing, and I try to avoid having meetings where I'm sort of only in editing mode, but I really should be thinking more deeply about what's going on. I think the comment here about figuring out joyous versus figuring out annoyed. Yeah, I mean, I will say that I like figuring stuff out when it's a question of nobody's figured this out, we haven't figured this out, let's go figure out what to do. It's all good. When it's like there's somebody else should have figured it out, there's a big mess. I don't even mind so much cleaning up the mess if it's a sort of creative process to clean up the mess. What is terrible is when it's like somebody's supposed to have figured this out, they say they figured it out, but I start picking at it, and pretty soon a thread has been pulled out and the whole thing starts to unravel. That is not my happiest moment, so to speak. And I see the thing starting to unravel and I get more and more annoyed because I'm realizing that this thing that I thought I wasn't going to have to spend any time on, actually the whole thing's going to unravel and it's all going to be dropped in my lap and I'm going to have to figure it out. And while once I have gotten used to the idea I'm going to have to figure it out, I'm probably okay with that because I like figuring stuff out. But that moment where it's sort of crumbling and things are, it's becoming clear that there's a lot more to figure out than I thought, those are not the happiest moments. I think I do tend to maintain, I mean, you could probably tell from these live streams, I maintain a certain degree of intensity and I kind of do that all the time. It's very rare that I'm in kind of laid back kind of whatever type mode. And I suppose, I don't know, I think it always feels like the well, I get bored, where I'm in a kind of a laid back mode, and I kind of feel like I want to be doing another thing. And it's particularly sort of notable, particularly in these times when there are just a lot of opportunities on the both intellectual side, technology side, other kinds of things, that there's just always more stuff to do, and I'm always enthusiastic about doing it. Anyway, so Parker was asking, what are my personality traits that have made me become an entrepreneur? I have to say, I think I probably would be a lousy employee. I think that I like to think for myself. I like to figure things out for myself. If somebody says for anything significant, we're experts, just do this, I tend to not like that very much. My life experience has been that if I don't understand it, it's the correct heuristic to say, if I don't understand it, I don't believe it. And because I've been able to find that I can understand a fair amount of stuff. And when people are like, just trust me, don't try to understand it, usually has not, in my experience, ended well. And that has a certain, I think probably a certain resonance with, although I haven't really tried it, of, somebody else is sort of deciding the strategy, just fit into that strategy. Now, having said that, I've done a certain amount of, in the long distant past, I did a certain amount of strategy consulting for technology companies mostly in the 1980s. And I always found that I had already sort of been involved in running a company before that, I found that kind of consulting in some ways sort of relaxing, because it was like, look, I can tell you what I think you should do. You may not do it, but I don't have to be the one sort of taking responsibility for what happens in the end. It was relaxing, but ultimately frustrating, because it's like, look, I figured out what should happen. It turns out I was right in the end, but you did the exact opposite and it didn't end well. And it's like, gosh, I wish I was running this myself, so to speak. And that is indeed what leads one to choose to run things oneself. I think that the other piece of leading things with people and so on is you have to have a certain confidence that, if you're always second guessing yourself and worrying about, oh, did I make the right decision? And, this person is saying they don't agree with that. Oh, I must be wrong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's worth listening to them if they have something sensible to say, but it's also, you just have to kind of steam forward, and you have to not kind of be insecure about what's happening. And you also have to take the point of view, you're going to do the best you can, and you're going to do the best you can by the people you have. But, in the end, it's something where you're just going to do the best you can. And if it doesn't, if there's a, being responsible for those people is, or for the sort of the work of those people is something which one could get very wound up about. I've seen people get very wound up about that. But my point of view is I'll do the best I can to lead in the right direction, and that's what I'm going to do. And it doesn't, I hope usually I get it right. Sometimes I'll get it wrong, but I don't get terribly kind of wound up about that issue. I think the kind of other personality traits that are important in these kinds of things, I mean, you have to be practical. I mean, in the end, you can have all kinds of, I have certain ideological principles. Like, I like to do things that I feel good about having done. I like to not, I like to make sure that I don't regret the things I do, and so on. So that's kind of an ideological principle, but in the end, it's pretty practical. It's like, there's this situation with people, and we've got this sort of strategy question, and let's be practical about thinking about what to do. I think the important feature, which people seem to understand more rarely than you would imagine, is just, if you have good analytical skills, maybe you've done science or something like that, well, you can apply those analytical skills to thinking about business and things like that. But people have a terrible habit of not doing that, of saying, even though we could use those analytical skills, we switch them off. We just go purely by instinct when we're doing business. Now, having said that, I realize that a lot of things that I do kind of about business and strategy and so on are effectively by instinct. But I think that's just because, I've been doing this a long time. And so many of the things I see, it's like I know something from my experience base that looked an awful lot like that. And so I kind of have an intuition about what should be done. But in cases where it's just like nothing like that is something I've seen before, then kind of go into analysis mode and try and figure out what to do. There's a question here about, have you questioned your competence? And if you did, what did you do in that situation? I try and do things that are hard. So I'm kind of used to questioning my own competence in the sense that it is, in many things I've done and many things people in similar kinds of business situations and so on to mine have done, you never do anything hard. And you are able to, most of the time, just sort of cruise on the experience that you've had. The problem with that, one of the issues with that happens is if something hard comes up, you're kind of like, oh my gosh, there's something hard. I've never seen something hard. And you kind of freak out about it. I've perhaps had the better situation that I'm constantly doing things that are hard. And I'm constantly in a situation where, like, for example, economics, I was talking about earlier, I'm trying to learn something about economics. I've learned things over the years and I've had a few bursts of activity trying to learn things. But, when I'm starting to talk about, can we have a theory of economics based on our physics project, for example, that's a situation in which, gosh, I don't really know. It's a thing where it could be that economic thinking is just one of those things I'll never wrap my brain around. And this might be a thing that is something I just can't, something you can kind of bite and not be able to, bitten off something you can't eat type thing. I don't know, but that's happening to me a lot. And so I'm kind of used to that happening. And I think the thing that I try to achieve is not so much do I know that I can do it. I know I can do lots of stuff and I'm going to try and do it. There might be something where I really ultimately can't do it, possibly because nobody can do it, possibly because it's the wrong century to try to do it. It's just not possible right now. But I think the important thing is to try to be good at knowing when you don't know and being able to realize that, well, I haven't really gotten there yet. Like, for example, for economics, I feel like I don't really understand what the core issues are yet. I probably will, but maybe I won't. I think that when it comes to, I think the thing that for me is really quite important is you're doing a project, you're going in some direction, you hit something which you don't know, and it's hard. Okay, so you push a certain amount to try and get over that barrier. Maybe you succeed. It's having the confidence to believe that just because other people haven't gotten over this barrier, it's still possible that I could. That's important. But at some point you may realize this barrier is so tall, I can't get over it, or maybe it's not worth getting over. Maybe I could if I put enough effort in, but the effort is not worth it. And so then what you end up doing is kind of pivoting what you're looking at and, pivoting the project. And I think I've sort of realized that's something that it's, to be able to pivot, you have to have kind of the big picture view. If you're down in the trench and you're kind of, you're just digging forward, digging through that trench, you're never going to be able to pivot. So in other words, if you're, in an organization, when you have people where their particular job is this, they don't have a bigger picture view of what's going on, they're just going to keep going along, doing what they think their job is. They'll never have that kind of zoomed out view where they realize, gosh, if you look from above, you can realize actually you can just jump to that other trench and you'll be in much better shape. So I think that kind of reversing, when things get difficult, kind of reversing and saying, what's the big picture? What are we really trying to achieve? Maybe there's a way to achieve what we're really trying to achieve without digging through this particular issue. That's an important thing to do. I realized only very recently, and it's something happened 40 years ago, so I'm kind of embarrassed I didn't realize it earlier. When I was first working on simple computational systems and simple programs and the universe of possible programs and so on, one of the things that happened was I discovered that it was hard to tell what was going to happen. And there were other people who I'd gotten involved in working on this, including some very excellent mathematicians, for example. When they saw that things got hard, they just gave up. They said, the methods we have don't work, we're giving up. Instead, what I realized, kind of only after the fact by 40 years, is that the key thing that I did was to realize the very fact that it's hard is interesting. And that led to computational irreducibility, led to all kinds of science and so on. So in other words, that was, the trench that one was in was the let's go figure out how these systems work. Turns out that was hard. But then what one realized was there was a much more interesting thing to look at, which came about from realizing that the fact that these were hard was interesting. So I think that's, that tends to be my belief. And I think it's an important thing for people in general is when things get hard, why are you doing what you're doing? Are you really trying to solve the problem the right way? I mean, you can end up with this incredibly elaborate solution that incredibly difficult to drill through this, this rock, but actually you just have to back up and you can walk over the hill and get to the other side. And it's easy if you have if you have a zoomed out view of what you're trying to do. And I think that, from the point of view of companies and management, that can be kind of tricky because typically companies have a sort of hierarchical structure and there's lots of individual groups and individual people doing what they do. And down in those trenches, so to speak, it can be challenging to see the big picture and to realize that you can kind of redirect. I certainly try with our company to make people aware of what the bigger picture sort of around the things they're doing is. I don't always succeed at that. That's a hard thing to do, particularly with a company like ours that has just a lot of stuff going on. I mean, I had this plan years ago now that we had this big chart of all the things that our company was doing. And when more people were physically in an office, we put up in break rooms these big charts that sort of just show sort of visually the different things the company is doing. We managed to get one iteration of that, but it was too hard to maintain. And it wasn't clear that anybody was looking at it. But I tend to give a couple of company meetings every year and so on, where I try and outline, I try and describe these are the things that we're doing globally as a company, and here's why we're doing them. And I think that's a useful synchronization point, although there's typically so much stuff to talk about for our particular company that it's quite challenging to be able to explain these things. Gosh, let's see, all kinds of interesting questions here. Well, the most recent one was from Juan. What methodology do you use when you have a problem? We have to solve a problem you don't know how to solve, but it has to be solved fast. Well, I mean, it depends what kind of problem it is, but I think, my best kind of, I suppose, the analogy approach of what's the closest thing I've seen before is the best I can do. Now, if it's a hard problem, it has to be solved fast. I would say, what I will tend to do as a very practical matter is, let's say we've got a few hours to solve something. Some technical infrastructure thing is broken. What I tend to do is, I kind of get all the relevant people and I kind of try and talk it through, and I try and lead the effort to talk it through. And what I found is that okay, so a typical kind of thing, let's say there's some infrastructure problem, technical infrastructure problem. For the first half hour, 2 hours, whatever, we have great people, and there's a high likelihood they'll just solve the problem. I'll never even necessarily hear about it. But they haven't solved the problem, and it's been a few hours, and this thing urgently has to be solved. It's like, what's actually going to happen? Could say, okay, well, it's the job of this person over here and that person over there to solve this problem. I used to think I should do that. I stopped thinking that maybe 15 years ago now. And I just say, I'm just going to jump into this. I'm an experienced problem solver, and it's kind of like, let me try and lead the effort to solve this problem. And, when one has talented people working on these things, there's a certain style I try to adopt of being able to pull out of talented people in those kinds of situations the best things one can. I also think that because I've seen lots of problems before, perhaps I tend not to, people sometimes get more flustered by, oh my gosh, there's this thing, it's happening, we got to solve this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, jump too quickly. I mean, I've seen enough of these things before that it's kind of like I kind of get some sense of how systematic one has to be to solve the problem. And sometimes, let's say it's a technical infrastructure problem. There's some things where you say, well, try this, try that, try that. Okay, that's my set of things that I get from my experience. I think one thing that I've tried to learn to be fairly good at is to know when I have exhausted the easy things that I know what to do with. So, somebody will show me something and they'll say, do you know how to solve this problem? And I know that in 15 minutes, I will be able to tell them all the stuff that is based on experience, this is the easy thing to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I will have, at some point, I will have exhausted all that sort of low-hanging solutions. And then after that, in order to get further, I have to be very systematic. And I think the thing that I tend to do is, okay, you have some problems to solve. I always like to kind of go back to the basics. Don't make any assumptions. What's really going on? Can I understand it kind of all the way down? And I found that even when it's a problem where, okay, again, there tends to be two stages. One is the fast, does it match some pattern I already know before? Try this, try this, try this. Is it one of these? Oh, it's, and very likely the answer is, oh yes, it's that, great, fine, that solves the problem. But let's say you don't, let's say 1/3 of the time, all of those solutions miss. So then what are you going to do? Well, then what I tend to do is to say, okay, we've got to be systematic, even though, we know this is going to take half an hour, whatever it's going to take to be systematic in this way. We're really not going to be able to get there by jumping more quickly because we've already exhausted the kind of low-hanging fruit. And, occasionally when you start digging in, you'll see another piece of low-hanging fruit, but often you really have to go quite systematically through things to get to the point where you have where you have enough of an understanding to be able to see something that was perhaps something that was very different from anything you'd ever experienced before. I mean, that's a type of thing I tend to do. I mean, I think that as I say, the important thing as far as I'm concerned is sort of you skim off the easy stuff. Can it be done that way? You make sure, and somebody says to you, oh, no, it couldn't possibly be that, based on something that's in your experience, if you're solving some problem there. I don't know, you have to push a little bit harder than that, because sometimes there's like, people have this, the thing that tends to happen, and it's always a problem that I find too, but I think I kind of have tried to develop methods for avoiding it, is, you've got a problem, there's a problem. You immediately think it must be this. You keep drilling, it's got to be that, it's got to be that. Let's go keep on, drilling that it's that. And if it's like, oh, of course it couldn't be this other thing because something about the sort of pattern of that other thing didn't fit, so it couldn't be that other thing. And so then you completely ignore that, even though in the end, after you drilled on the thing you were sure it was and it didn't work out, you should have gone back to the thing that you were sure it wasn't based on some feature. I mean, you see this a lot in medical diagnosis, for example. People might have, 5 different things. They have certain symptoms. There are 5 different things that might be wrong. You do a bunch of tests. You have some theory that one of those is the thing. Well, you think based on the tests, you've ruled out 3 of those things. Okay, you've got 2 possibilities. You drill harder and harder and harder on those 2 possibilities. Then it turns out, well, actually, after zillions of other tests or whatever else, you realize, no, neither of those 2 possibilities can be right. Then you start looking at even different things. But it turns out the correct thing to have done is to go back to those things that you excluded before, because you had a reason to exclude them, but that had a certain probability of being an incorrect exclusion. And that is a much more likely to be correct thing than, if there were 5 things originally, than the 7th thing that you hadn't thought of at all. You should go back to the things that you thought you excluded before. And that's a typical thing in problem solving that I've seen, technical infrastructure problems, other kinds of problems, is the thing that one had already excluded because one had a little argument for why that was impossible. After you've drilled the thing that you then thought was the hypothesis, you've got to go back and look at that thing that you had excluded before. And there's a tremendous sort of psychological pressure to not do that. And I think one way you tend to avoid that is going, zooming out all the way and saying, what is the basic question here? What's the basic thing? And then you may be led back to those things that you had otherwise excluded. Let's see. A question here from Sugar about how do I stay organized in general? Specifically, how do I organize and write papers and books? Well, let's see. I'm, I guess I lead an assisted life in some sense, in the sense that I have, a company with project management systems and lots of structure that gets kind of a lot of projects that are involved with other people, involved with teams and so on, tend to get structured in very kind of professional project management-y kinds of ways. So in a sense, that should not be attributed to me. That's really the whole sort of project management structure. When it comes to my own personal projects that I'm doing, I partly organize things by my file system. What tends to happen is some piece of information will come in, and it's like, some random thing about biological evolution, let's say, topic I'm interested in, but I'm not thinking about it right then. So what I've tended to do is I just have a bucket, a place in my file system where I say, research, biology, evolution. Okay, throw it in there. When I really get active in thinking about that topic, I'll pull out all the things that were in that bucket, so to speak, and look through them. So I do the same thing. I have done the same thing for a long time with folders and email, although I'm actually transitioning to not doing that so much and just using the file system for those kinds of things. Now, the number of buckets that I have is probably 50 or something like that. It's not an infinite number. It's a number small enough that sort of I personally remember every single one of them. And over time, eventually one of them will become active and I'll start working on it. I'll dig through what's there. And eventually after that's finished, it will go in an archive subfolder that is, I'm done with that one. It's now archived. And so that tends to be the way that I organize those kinds of things. When it comes to writing things, I think I've said this before, I tend to be, I try very hard to be a one-pass writer these days. In the past, when I was writing, for example, New Kind of Science, that was an incredibly, excruciatingly slow process, which took a decade. And I was writing, a good day, I'd write one page. In my effort to write down the things that I think about and not just leave them unwritten, I've taken the sort of opposite optimization of write quickly, because otherwise I just won't get a lot of these things written down. And so I tend to be pretty sequential. I'll understand some topic and I'll just go through and try and sequentially write it. Now, what can go wrong with that is if there are all sorts of, I will have previously done a bunch of research and computations, and hopefully I will have clarified the main points so that I'm ready to just write, so to speak. And so I can do this kind of one-pass writing. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way. And there end up being sort of nasty points where I get to some place and then I get stuck and I have to do a bunch of research. Maybe that proves that the things I already written weren't correct. I try to sort of follow the principle, don't write stuff down unless I know what I'm talking about, because it's much more painful to go back and disentangle the things that have to be changed after you finally sort of nailed down what was going on. Let's see. There's a question from Sam here. Are there specific questions, audits that I routinely run on my business life or thought processes to facilitate innovation? I would say the main thing is the what's the point question. What's the thing I'm really trying to do here? The zoom out type question. That's the most common thing. I think that, by the way, with respect to organization, I maintain kind of I maintain in my file system the list of sort of all projects I'm thinking about doing. Slightly more locally, I have a terribly antiquated habit, which is I actually have pieces of paper, and at any given time, I'll have a bunch of things that I've written on a piece of paper that, maybe 20 things or something that I'm trying to do in the fairly short term. And what I've discovered is I have a whole sort of code for myself. I probably developed it decades ago, where I when I've done something, I have a very good way of kind of scribbling it out on a piece of paper, and it's kind of like very satisfying. And then when something is kind of sort of floated away and is sort of getting delegated somewhere else, I have this kind of little way of putting crosshatch through it to kind of indicate that it's partly done, and so on. And then what happens is my pieces of paper, and this is very antiquated. I've tried various electronic versions of these, but it's not quite as satisfying as just having, that pad of paper with its one page in front where I've written things down. And once I've crossed out most of the stuff on a piece of paper, I'll literally copy over that piece of paper, the things that still are left to be done, onto something else and get ready to work on those. Very antiquated. And, I've certainly, as I say, I've often tried doing that in files and just in, notebooks and things like that. And I just don't find it quite as compelling. And they tend to be, the notebooks tend to get sort of lost in my file system. I always have sort of to-do areas and things like that. It's not quite as compelling and immediate as having that piece of paper on your desk type thing. Very antiquated, but I tend to use that approach. I think that this kind of big picture, why are we doing this question, is always important. I also try, and at our company, it's been actually quite a challenge over the years to maintain a list of all projects we're doing. And we have an actual group that is maintaining that list. We typically have the sort of state of projects in that global project list. And the global project list has maybe probably a couple of hundred active projects on it, I think. So it's not a huge number, but it's not a tiny number either. And it typically goes through kind of a new project that hasn't really been discussed much, an investigational phase of the project, a green-lighted phase, an underway phase, and then a maintenance phase when it's finished. And the green-lighted phase basically means, yes, we're going to do this project. We know what's involved. We don't have the resources right now. This project has to be queued behind other things because it has dependencies on resources getting freed up from other projects. There's another important status for projects, which is hibernated, which is we thought we were going to do this. We considered doing it. We decided now is not the right time to do it. Maybe we even started doing it. Turned out it was too difficult. Turned out that there just wasn't a justification for doing it right now. Hibernate it. We do a pretty good job, I think, of maintaining all the information of hibernated projects. And I have to say, even for projects of my own, I've recently just been doing a project that got hibernated sometime in the early 1990s and, brought it back to life. Those Wolfram language pieces of code are still there. You can it comes back to life. We can start doing it again. It now has become perhaps possible, it may not work even now, because of sort of improved algorithms and technology and so on. So, I think that's kind of the approach that I tend to use. But having this sort of somewhat modestly sized kind of global project list for the company is an important thing because it gives me kind of a bird's eye view of what's going on. And I think one of the roles, at least in my company, as sort of a CEO role, is I'm constantly telling people, oh, do you know about what's going on in this other group? It's like that seems to be particularly in my kind of one-on-ones with our senior management folk and so on. An awful lot of that is, they're telling me about things they're doing. Oh, by the way, have you looked at what's going on in this other group? Or do you know about this other initiative that we have? As I say, I don't know how to improve. I mean, we have the weekly internal newsletter. We have all these other kinds of things. I don't know how to improve for a company like ours, given the number of projects we're doing. I don't really know how to improve that communication. And that ends up being kind of a CEO kind of role to sort of provide that communication between groups. There's a comment here from Juan. Problem solving with other people requires understanding other people's psychology. How do you go about understanding how to influence others to be efficient at solving problems? You're right that it absolutely requires understanding other people's psychology, and it requires understanding your interaction with their psychology. So there are people that I find that I'm really quite good at brainstorming certain kinds of things with. And there are people where I know the people are terrific, they do fantastic work, but I can't brainstorm stuff with them. There just isn't the right kind of dynamic of going back and forth. And for me, one of the issues is in any given area where I'm sort of brainstorming things, if I'm dealing with people where they're a little bit, it takes them a while to understand that, or they're people who like to sort of consider things before saying anything, that doesn't work for me personally particularly well. It's much better for me to have kind of the people who kind of understand and respond quickly. That kind of, increases the energy of my brainstorming rather than well, do you understand that? Do you understand that? Do you understand, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which kind of kills the dynamic of sort of the brainstorming session. But yes, there's a certain psychology there. And, I've also found, you have to know a bit about the people you're working with, because there are things where people will say obstinately, it's just not possible, just impossible. And you have to kind of, get them off that ledge. And, it's a psychology type thing to understand, what do you need to tell them? I mean, sometimes just saying, look, I realize that it's hard, is rather than, that it's bad for some people if you're just saying, no, it's possible. And they are thinking to themselves, look, it's really hard. The only thing I'm going to be able to respond is it's not possible. But, by admitting that that it's hard and you talk about why it's hard, then that's a way around that problem for certain kinds of people. I think I noticed a comment from memes here about good banter can enhance the conversation. Yeah, I mean, there are certainly times I don't know. I'm not sure. I as an individual, I'm always thinking of random puns and other sort of funny things to say, and sometimes I'll say them, but often I don't bother because I think they're really. I'm not sure how useful they are. I mean, sometimes when things are, it is useful when everybody says, oh, I don't know. I mean, there's a certain when you're brainstorming things, trying to solve problems and so on. It's with some people, it's worth saying, look, we're doing something really hard, and we should be proud of ourselves for the fact that we can do something really hard. With other people, as soon as you say that, they're like, it's like, walking on a tightrope or something, and you look down, and that's deadly, so to speak. So you don't want to do that. And it's more like, don't think about how hard this is. Just keep trying to figure out what to do, kind of thing. And I think it varies with the person quite a bit. And I think one of the things that, for example, sometimes the sort of the humor and cultural kinds of things, because I work with people from all sorts of different backgrounds from all over the world. Sometimes it's just funny that one even has those things. There are things where I know in kind of modern popular American culture, this or that thing, but I know that that's going to be for half the people in the meeting. It's like they don't know anything about that. Of course, in some cases, the person who's working on the opposite side of the world in a completely different culture might know more about popular American culture in some area than I do, and that certainly happens plenty. But it's something where it's certain kinds of things are not as doesn't work as well to kind of do that when you have a diverse group that you're working with, where really the thing that brings them together is kind of the intellectual problem solving of the particular problem, rather than kind of these sort of more everyday world kinds of things. But I think, there's the question about how to influence others to be more efficient at solving problems. The one thing that I just can't emphasize enough is, keep the thinking apparatus engaged. Don't just sort of decide, oh, no, I'm not an expert at that. I'll just take what the experts say and I won't worry about how that works. It's like, keep thinking at all stages and so on. So maybe one or two more, and then I am supposed to go to a quite different meeting. Okay, let's see. There's a question here from Sammy. How do you deal with multiple smart people in your teams disagreeing with each other, e.g. team A proposes doing one thing, team B proposes doing another thing. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I would say that drawing out in a sort of Socratic way what people are actually proposing is a very useful thing to do. By the time team A, person A is saying this, person B is saying the opposite, and they're kind of like locked horns and they're just bashing on the same issue, you kind of lost the game. I think the way that you have to do it is it's like, well, what about these issues that neither of you have thought about? What about, let's sort of Socratically ask these questions sort of that go a little bit outside of the particular track on which everybody has locked horns. I mean, I think that's a good kind of approach. And I think, sometimes the horn locking is very, okay. Sometimes it's not, in our particular organization, I would say that we managed to have a company culture where people are about solving problems. And it's not so much about the ego of, did I manage to solve that or did somebody else manage to solve that? It's like, be happy we managed to solve the problem type thing. And I think what can often happen, which I consider to be not a bad thing in our company, is people get quite passionate about what they're doing and they're very certain that this is the right thing to do. We really need to do this type thing. And they're not doing that out of ego. They're doing that out of sort of passion for doing the thing they want to do. And it's something where, there are cases where people are just like, I got to prove I'm smarter than this other person. At least in our organization, that doesn't tend to end very well. I think in other kinds of organizations with a different kind of structure. I mean, I think one of the things in our organization that really helps is that our management team is pretty much all doers. We don't have people who are sort of like pure managers of things. The people who manage things are people who are good at doing things. Although there are people who are good at doing things that don't do management because they don't want to, or they're not really oriented in that direction. But the people who are managing things, they know how to do stuff, and they're typically good at doing things. And that has the effect that kind of it doesn't end up being the case that it's all about people, that it's all about, well, I'm going to trust so-and-so just because of that personality. It's like the person who's managing can actually drill down and understand what that person is doing. And so they can know, oh yeah, that makes sense, great, very nice, or that doesn't make sense. And even though it may be the nicest person in the world, and even though they may have, be able to talk very well about what they're doing, the person who's managing it can drill down enough to see that, no, it doesn't really look okay inside type thing. Now, sometimes that drilling process can be pretty painful. I mean, I know I've been very concerned recently about the speed of a bunch of things, a bunch of software that we have. And so I've had this kind of whole push for speed type thing. And, drilling for that can be really painful because people have worked on some big software system. They kind of want to build the next piece of functionality. Those particular people are not so into making it faster. They're like, sure, they did more or less the right thing. They don't really want to be kind of dragged through the underbrush of, how does the thing actually work and why isn't it faster and so on. And it can be pretty painful. And I've had that experience actually very recently where you really have to drill very hard. And people, at least in our organization, if I just kept on saying, you got to make it happen in 50 milliseconds. Sorry, you just got to make it happen in 50 milliseconds. And, right now it's taking 300 milliseconds or something. And I just say, management statement, it's got to happen in 50 milliseconds. I don't know how that ends because that isn't what I do. They're saying, well, we can't make it any faster than 300 milliseconds. Okay, why not? What's it actually doing? Oh, it's doing this and that and the other. Okay, show me what it's doing. Well, I think it's doing this. Well, actually, we've never actually instrumented that. Oh, well, there's this giant log file of 10,000 lines long that is what it's doing. Well, what's it actually doing inside? Well, we don't really know because it's a 10,000 line log file. Well, go read it into Wolfram language, or I'll do it right now myself. and start aggregating pieces and make histograms of things and so on. And pretty soon you're actually off and running and solving things. And I think sometimes even the very fact that I sometimes will dive in and, actually do a little bit of actually solving the problem. I don't have to go all the way. I just have to point people in the direction of this is a problem that can be solved. And here's a direction that we might go. And even though they might solve it a different way in the end, the very idea that you could really roll up your sleeves and start solving that problem is very useful. It gives a certain confidence that this is not an unscalable tower. This is something that you can actually, start really doing. I think, but this question about, in sometimes, when you have groups, people, whatever, that have locked horns in some terrible way, I have to say that the sad fact is that what I've noticed is when that happens big time, usually within 6 months, both people have left for one reason or another. Even if you were sure that person A was right and person B wasn't, and whatever, something about that sort of horn locking process just never really ends very well. And from a management point of view, you definitely want to avoid that horn locking, and you want to be able to sometimes, like what's a good example? I just saw one actually this morning, now that I think about it, which is probably a miscommunication. And that's a prime case of this. Okay, there are people who they'll send a piece of email, somebody will send another piece of email. It's like based on those pieces of email, people are all upset because no, this thing went horribly wrong. But in the end, if you actually talk to the person, you'll discover that it wasn't really as bad as you thought, and you just didn't quite understand what was said in the email. And that a person, long-time person at our company who is now kind of semi-retired, I would say, doing other things. I was always amused back in the past. He would be the most aggressive person you can imagine in email, and people would always be complaining to me, "Oh my gosh, I got this incredibly aggressive piece of email from this person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." And it's a very nice guy. And I said, back in those days, just call him on the phone. And then they would have a lovely conversation and everybody would be happy. But in the email communication, it was like, for whatever reason, it was just like read as this incredibly aggressive kind of, why have you done this? What's that's the wrong thing type thing. And I think, by the time, so well, let's see. I probably should wrap up here. Maybe I can take one more thing if there's something thematically related here. Actually, there's a question here which okay, question from Erin here. Did I know Paul Graham between 2002 and 2005 when Y Combinator was founded? Yes, I did. And I was even at the first demo day of Y Combinator. And I sort of saw a bunch of, Y Combinator was originally based in Boston in Y Combinator is a startup incubator that's become very famous and distinguished and has spawned lots of well-known companies at this point. But back in the day, Paul Graham started it in a converted chocolate factory in Cambridge, fairly near where I live. And I went to a bunch of things there. They have a sort of this tradition of having a demo day where everybody gets to show things. What was shown there? There was I guess Reddit was one of the things that was there, and that demo day. And there was what became kind of through a rather circuitous route became Twitch, and probably a few other things that have been notable. But yes, so I have seen that. I talked to Paul about our NKS summer school that we'd started doing, and I don't know I've never really asked. I don't really know what the sort of relationship between any of the thinking there I mean, it's you know, I don't really know exactly how Y Combinator has evolved now. It had a very sort of a bunch of sort of college kids move to Boston for the summer and try and do startups, and Paul kind of advises them, was kind of the and Jessica, his wife now, and a few other people were kind of involved in advising them. Aaron also asks, in my experience advising CEOs, what have you found to be the most useful to them? Is the most useful thing different for different people, industries, projects, time periods? You know, I keep on emphasizing the what's the point. I think that's usually, it's like, what are you actually trying to achieve? And, oh, we've got this issue, we've got that issue. What are you actually trying to achieve? What's the bigger picture is one of the common things. The other common thing is crises. You know, something has happened and it's like, what the heck is one going to do? And, you know, I can quite often be useful in that because I've seen something like it before. And or sometimes it's like, well, let's just think about it. And people have a habit of saying, oh my gosh, this thing, you know, such and such a person just, you know, did some crazy thing, or such and such a project happened, or such and such a deal did this or that thing. It's like, okay, let's kind of just try and think through what are the issues, you know, what are the possibilities and so on. Okay, I guess I would say that a thing that tends to be, you know, perhaps my skill, if anything, is the think outside the box, but it really isn't outside the box, it's just zoomed out. And so it's like understanding what the point is and then being able to go in and find a different solution rather than kind of bashing against the same issue. You know, I think sometimes, look, the most common thing is people decide they have to do this or that thing. They haven't really looked around to see whether that's really right. And you have to kind of try to talk them out of this thing and point out what some of the other issues are. I mean, I would say that it's an interesting and challenging thing to do. I also think about sort of applying that to myself in sort of CEOing things. You know, I'm very intent on doing this or that thing. Okay, from the outside, is that actually the right thing to do or not? You know, that can be a challenging thing to apply to oneself. But I think that tends to be, I mean, look, the thing is, people have a terrible habit. Maybe it's just the CEOs that I end up advising because they tend to be on the more intellectual end of things. Sometimes there's a certain kind of ideological impracticality that can creep in. And that's something where it's like, look, we can just walk through, solve the problem. It's like, yes, you know, this or that thing, they're crazy and they're doing the wrong thing and they're going to destroy everything or whatever. And, you know, you can get very upset about that. But you know what? You can just walk through, see what are the possibilities, what can you do, et cetera, and try and kind of analytically reason and get to the other side. I mean, again, I would say that's probably okay. Another very typical thing is you say, why don't you do this? They say, I can't do that. Why not? Well, because of this and this and this and this and this. Okay, but you agree that doing it would actually be a good idea. And say, yes, it will be a good idea. I just can't get there from here. And so that's then really a case where it's like, okay, you take this step. Can you see the next step to take? Can you see the next step to get to that destination? And people will often say, well, look, you know, this is blocking it. Okay, let's understand that. You know, let's get rid of that obstruction. Okay, then there's another thing blocking it. Let's get rid of that obstruction. You keep going through those until eventually, yes, you can get there. And I think people tend to look at it and say, in a bit more of a sort of a knee-jerk way, oh my gosh, I can see there are lots of obstructions. There's so many obstructions, I can never get there. And that's where sort of trying to take a more analytical approach and practical approach of how do you solve that problem? How do you solve that problem? You know, will that let you get all the way through? Is something good. I mean, another thing that tends to happen. Okay, I mean, there are other things like like a very practical thing is that because I've been involved in the tech industry for a very long time now, I know lots of people and I kind of have some sense, people will say, should I go talk to so-and-so? It's like, well, I know so-and-so. And, no, it doesn't really make sense. That's not going to be a good conversation. Or I know somebody else and actually, yeah, you should talk to them, but, you'll like it and they'll like it and something might actually happen. And so, actually having enough intuition about the people and the companies, or sometimes people will say, I should partner with this company. And I'll say, look, the personality of that company is just, it's never going to work. It's never, that's never going to end well. Or, well, actually that company has, a personality and an ability to deal with, some organization of your size or whatever else that that's likely to work. Anyway, talking of which, yes, somebody with a Hindi-looking handle here is commenting that that I've had the good experience of being sort of in the room for lots of interesting kinds of innovations. Yes, I have. This is the consequence of knowing a lot of people in the tech industry. And I suppose one thing that's happened, which I don't know what's cause and what's effect. I kind of think that it's correlation rather than causation. But it turns out that an awful lot of people that I've gotten to know when they're at early stages in their careers have ended up doing very significant things. I mean, it's as I say, I'm not putting that to causation. I'm putting that only to correlation, so to speak. But that's meant that I've sort of had the interesting experience of seeing a lot of things in the tech industry and in science, actually, kind of gestate and see the people sort of before the great event, as well as, during and after the great event type thing. And that's been super useful to me because it gives me a much better intuition about what it sort of looks like. I mean, I'm constantly wondering because I deal a lot with kids and younger people because I like that a lot. I'm trying to I'm often modeling, okay, this kid aged 14 or something, 12, whatever, 16, whatever it is. That person reminds me an awful lot of this person who's now 55 years old or whatever, or now 75 years old. But I knew them back when they were, well, if they were 75, it wouldn't be the case. But if they were 55, I might very well have known them back when they were that age. And I can kind of see, yeah, this person's really like that. And that's how this trait, like, here's a person who's not doing particularly well in school because they're always figuring out their own things to do or figuring out their own sort of squiggly possibilities and so on. Oh yeah, I know somebody who was like that. And now, they're age 55 and they've been super successful. And you can kind of see the path that goes from the kind of squiggly kid to the very successful person, successful in a particular way. So that's been for me, that's a really something very interesting, enriching to kind of see that those trajectories. All right, I better wrap up here, but thanks very much for joining me, and thanks for lots of interesting questions and comments. And I look forward to doing this again another time.